Every one of these was once the safest bet money could buy. A machine glowing with 18,000 vacuum tubes, filling a room to do less math than the phone in your pocket. A steel tube long enough to hold your whole body, breathing for you when your own lungs gave up. One of them kept people alive for years. The wires that shrank the world. In May 1844, in a demonstration room strung between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., Samuel Morse flipped a switch and sent a message down a copper wire instead of down a road. Because a message once needed days or weeks by horse or ship, and electricity moves through wire almost as fast as light moves through air, the telegraph collapsed that weight into seconds. Operators tapped out short and long pulses, a signal system now called Morse code, standing in for every letter of the alphabet, the way flashing a light in patterns could spell out words across a dark field. If you stood in that first receiving room, you would hear nothing but a thin metallic clicking, and somehow that clicking was a sentence arriving faster than any messenger could run it. A letter that once took a week by stagecoach now took less time than it takes to boil a kettle. Engineers pushed a cable across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, failing on the first attempt in 1858, before a working line finally held in 1866, tying two continents together with wire. The undersea cables carrying internet traffic between continents today still roughly trace the paths telegraph engineers laid more than a century and a half ago. The floating giants of the sky. On May 6, 1937, over the Naval Air Station at Lakehurst, New Jersey, a German airship longer than 2.5 football fields eased down toward its mooring mast. Because hydrogen is far cheaper than helium, and the United States restricted helium exports at the time, the airship's builders filled its frame with hydrogen instead of the safer gas. A spark, likely from static electricity building on the ship's fabric skin, met that hydrogen, and the Hindenburg caught fire in under a minute, dropping in flames in front of a crowd. If you watched from the airfield that evening, you would have felt the heat from 100 yards away, and watched passengers leap from windows that were, moments earlier, 30 feet above the ground. Close to 40 people died that day, out of nearly 100 on board, after years of the public watching airships cross oceans without incident. The Graf Zeppelin, a sister ship, had already logged more than 1 million miles without a single passenger fatality. None of that record survived 9 seconds of newsreel footage. The age of airships didn't end with the design flaw buried in an engineering report. It ended on film, in front of everyone, and investment in passenger airships never recovered. The room that did arithmetic. In 1945, at the University of Pennsylvania, engineers switched on ENIAC, a computer built to calculate artillery firing tables for the military. Because a vacuum tube works like a tiny switch, letting current through or blocking it, engineers wired about 18,000 of them together to do arithmetic. So a task that once took a room of human mathematicians weeks could finish in hours. If you walked into that room, you would feel the heat first. Tubes glowing like a wall of small light bulbs, filling a space about the size of a school gymnasium, and technicians walking the rows with trays of spares because several tubes burned out and had to be replaced most days. The fragility followed the machine everywhere it went. Keeping ENIAC running took a full-time team simply hunting for the next tube about to fail, and the machine itself weighed close to 30 tons, about what a loaded semi-truck trailer carries. 2 years after ENIAC switched on, engineers at Bell Labs built the transistor, a solid sliver of material that did a tube's job without the glass, the heat, or the constant failures. Within a decade, a chip you could balance on a fingertip was outperforming a room that once needed its own cooling system. The fuel that poisoned by design. In the early 1920s, engineer Thomas Midgley Jr., working for General Motors, found that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline stopped the engine knock, that pinging sound caused by fuel igniting unevenly inside a cylinder. Because lead was cheap and effective at solving that knock, oil companies added it to gasoline sold at nearly every pump for decades, even after plant workers producing the additive began falling seriously ill. If you pulled up to a gas station pump sometime in the 1960s, there was no warning label anywhere in sight, and the exhaust drifting through a school parking lot at pickup time carried lead with it, unnoticed. Geochemist Claire Patterson, studying ice cores drilled out of Greenland, found lead levels rising sharply through the 20th century in ice as far from the nearest road as a coast-to-coast flight, and traced the source back to gasoline exhaust circling the entire planet. Patterson spent years pushing against an industry that dismissed his findings and tried to cut his funding. The United States finally banned leaded gasoline for cars in 1996, more than 7 decades after Midgley's discovery first went into a fuel tank, and Patterson, once frozen out of his own field, is now credited as one of the people who helped end it. The machine that breathed for you. This is the machine that spent decades breathing for people whose bodies had forgotten how. Through the 1940s and 50s, as polio epidemics swept across the United States, doctors faced patients whose chest muscles had been paralyzed by the virus, unable to pull air into their own lungs. Because the muscles that expand the ribcage had stopped working, engineers built a sealed steel chamber that changed air pressure around the whole body, pulling the chest outward, the way a bellows works in reverse. If you lay inside one, only your head would be outside the machine, resting through a rubber collar, watching the ceiling in a small angled mirror, listening to a steady mechanical whoosh for weeks, sometimes years. Hospital wards during the worst outbreaks lined up dozens of these chambers in rows, each one roughly 7 feet long, about the length of a large sofa. Jonas Salk's vaccine arrived in 1955 and emptied most of those wards within a few years. But the same idea, a machine breathing for a paralyzed chest, came back decades later in a quieter form, when modern ventilators filled hospital rooms during the COVID pandemic, still doing the iron lungs one job, just without the steel tube around the rest of you. The fireproof miracle in every wall. Through the middle of the 20th century, into the 1970s and beyond, builders packed asbestos into pipe insulation, ceiling tiles, brake pads, and school hallways because its fibers resist fire and heat better than almost anything else available at the time. So it became the default fireproofing choice in millions of homes, schools, and office buildings, trusted precisely because it seemed indestructible. The same fibers that shrugged off flame turned out to be friable, meaning brittle enough to crumble into a fine, invisible dust the moment a wall or ceiling tile was disturbed. If you wandered into a school basement during a 1960s renovation, you might have watched that dust drift through a shaft of afternoon light without a mask in sight, unaware that fibers thinner than a human hair, split many times over, were settling into your lungs. Symptoms connected to that exposure, including certain lung diseases, could take 20, 30, even 40 years to appear. So people who worked around asbestos in their 20s often learned the real cost of it in their 60s. The material built to outlast fire ended up outlasting a lot of the people who installed it, and buildings are still being carefully stripped of it today, decades after anyone believed it was safe. The city that mailed itself. Through the early 1900s, cities including New York and Paris built networks of pneumatic tubes running under their streets, moving canisters of letters, telegrams, and small packages between post offices and department stores. Because compressed air could push a sealed canister through a pipe far faster than any messenger on foot or bicycle, mail that once took an hour to cross town could arrive in minutes. If you waited at a post office counter using the system, you would hear a hiss and a thunk as a canister launched, then watch the pipe swallow it and disappear into the wall, gone before you finished counting your change. New York's underground network alone stretched something like 27 miles beneath Manhattan, roughly the distance from a downtown office to a suburb outside the city limits. As telephones and later fax machines spread through offices and homes, a network of pipes running under an entire city became an expensive thing to keep repairing for a job a phone line could now do instead. Most of these tube systems shut down by the mid-20th century, but the exact same technology survives today in miniature, humming behind the walls of bank drive-thrus and hospital pharmacies, still hissing canisters back and forth, just on a much smaller map. The silver line under your tongue. For more than a century, the mercury thermometer was the standard way to check a fever. A thin glass tube holding a column of liquid mercury that sat under the tongue or under an arm. Because mercury expands at a steady, predictable rate as it warms, the silver line climbing the glass could measure body temperature with real precision. The same idea behind an old porch thermometer. If you sat still holding one under your tongue for a full 3 minutes as a kid, you were probably also warned, at least once, not to bite down, because the glass and the mercury inside it were both fragile in ways that mattered. The mercury in a single broken thermometer, no bigger than a large raindrop, is enough to require a hazardous materials cleanup and can contaminate an amount of water close to what fills a small backyard pool. As mercury's effect on the nervous system became harder to ignore, hospitals and schools began phasing the thermometers out through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, replacing them with digital and infrared versions that read a temperature in seconds instead of minutes. Plenty of households, by some surveys, never got around to throwing the old ones away. The coin booth on every corner. Through the 1960s and 70s, before households carried a phone anywhere with them, public payphones filled that gap on street corners and outside gas stations, each one built around a rotary dial and a coin slot that clicked as it counted your quarter. Because turning that dial a set distance for each number sent a matching series of electrical clicks down the line, the phone exchange could tell exactly which number you were trying to reach, no keypad required. If you ducked into one of those booths with a folding glass door pulled shut behind you, you would have felt for a quarter in your pocket, listened for the dial tone, and watched your own breath fog the glass in the cold while you waited for someone to pick up. The country was blanketed with something like 2.6 million public payphones by the time they peaked in the mid-1990s. As mobile phone ownership climbed through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the coins dropping into those slots slowed to a trickle that no longer covered the cost of keeping the booths running. Payphones existed to connect strangers to help in an emergency. Today, nearly everyone carries that same emergency line in their own pocket instead. If any of these machines were part of your own life, tell us which one in the comments below.